You are standing in the dimly lit corridor beneath the Colosseum, and you can hear it, the roar of 50,000 Romans screaming for blood, your blood specifically. The ground trembles with their stamping feet, and through the iron gate ahead, you can see the blinding sunlight of the arena floor. In about 30 seconds, that gate will open, you'll step out onto the sand, and someone is going to try very, very hard to kill you. Welcome to your first day as a Roman gladiator. Spoiler alert, it's probably going to be your last. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've seen Gladiator, you've played video games, you've watched Spartacus. How hard could it be? You're reasonably fit, you know how to throw a punch, and you've got that can-do attitude that got you through college. You're ready for this, except you're not even close. And over the next 20,000 words or so, I'm going to explain exactly why you, yes, you, watching this video from the comfort of your couch would absolutely, positively, definitely not survive a single day as a Roman gladiator. This isn't going to be a story about honor, glory, or Russell Crowe looking heroic in slow motion. This is going to be the real, brutal, horrifying truth about what life was actually like for the men who fought and died in the arenas of ancient Rome. And trust me, the reality is so much worse than the movies ever showed you. We're going to cover everything: the training that would break your body and spirit, the living conditions that make prison look like a spa, the social stigma that made you less than human in Roman eyes, the actual combat that was far more gruesome than Hollywood depicts, and the countless ways you could die that have nothing to do with a fair fight in the arena. By the end of this, you're going to be very, very grateful that you were born in the 21st century, where the most dangerous thing you face is traffic, and your most brutal fight is with the self-checkout machine at the grocery store. So take a deep breath. Enjoy that air conditioning. Appreciate that you're not covered in other people's blood. And let's step into the arena. Chapter 1. How you became a gladiator. Spoiler, nothing good happened. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth. You didn't choose to be here. Nobody wakes up one morning in ancient Rome and thinks, you know what, I'd love to fight to the death for the entertainment of strangers. Becoming a gladiator was something that happened to you, not something you chose. And the ways it could happen were all various flavors of terrible. You are now standing in chains in a Roman slave market. Maybe you're a prisoner of war. Rome just conquered your homeland, killed your family, and shipped you here in the hold of a ship where half your fellow captives died of disease. Maybe you're a criminal convicted of some crime, which could be anything from murder to simply being Christian. And this is your sentence. Maybe you're so desperately poor that you literally sold yourself into gladiatorial service because starvation seemed worse. Or maybe, and this is darkly ironic, you're a slave who displeased your master, and he's decided that the appropriate punishment is to send you to gladiator school. Let's focus on the most common scenario. You're a prisoner of war. Rome has just finished another successful military campaign, and congratulations, you're part of the loot. You've been marched hundreds of miles in chains, watching your fellow prisoners drop dead from exhaustion and dehydration. The Romans don't particularly care. There are always more where you came from. When you arrive in Rome, you're sold at auction. A lanista, that's the owner and trainer of a gladiatorial school, or ludus, examines you like you're a horse he's thinking of buying. He checks your teeth, your muscle structure, your reflexes. He's looking for raw material that he can transform into a profitable fighting machine. And profitable is the key word here, because this is a business, and you are an investment. If you're lucky, and I'm using that word very loosely, you're young, strong, and reasonably healthy. The lanista sees potential and buys you. If you're not, you might be sold to the mines or the quarries, which is actually a worse fate because at least gladiators have a chance of survival. Mine workers just die slowly in the dark. But let's say you get bought for the ludus. Congratulations, you're now property of the gladiatorial school, and your life expectancy has just dropped dramatically. The lanista has made an investment in you. You cost money to buy. You'll cost money to train and feed. and he won't see a return on that investment until you start winning fights in the arena. This means several things, and none of them are good for you. First, it means you're valuable enough to keep alive, for now. The lanista isn't going to kill you in training or let you starve, because that would be bad business. But he's also not going to coddle you, because soft gladiators die in the arena, and dead gladiators don't earn money. You're going to be pushed right to the edge of what a human body can endure, and sometimes past it. Second, it means you have no rights whatsoever. You're not a person anymore. You're a thing, a piece of equipment, a tool for making money. You can be beaten, sold, loaned out, or killed at your owner's discretion. The law doesn't protect you. Society doesn't care about you. You exist solely to fight, and eventually to die in a way that entertains the Roman public. Third, it means you're about to enter a world with its own brutal hierarchy and culture. The ludus is part prison, part military barracks, part slaughterhouse. You're going to live in cells with other men who are just as desperate and violent as the situation has made them. Some will become your brothers in arms. Others will be your worst enemies, and all of you are trapped in this same nightmare together. Now let's talk about the minority of gladiators who actually volunteered. Yes, they existed. They were called auctorati, and they were free men who signed a contract to fight as gladiators. Why would anyone do this? 3 reasons: crushing debt, desperate poverty, or rarely, the pursuit of fame and glory. The debt situation was particularly cruel. If you owed money, you couldn't pay in ancient Rome. Your options were limited, and all bad. You could go to debtor's prison, you could sell yourself into slavery, or you could sign a gladiator contract that would pay off your debts in exchange for a certain number of fights. Many men chose the latter, figuring that at least this way they had some chance of survival and eventual freedom. The poverty motivation was similar. If you were free but so poor that you couldn't feed your family, the signing bonus for becoming a gladiator might seem like a lifeline. The ludus would pay your debts, give you food and housing, and train you in a valuable skill, killing people. The fact that the skill would probably get you killed was something desperate men tried not to think about too hard. The glory seekers were a special kind of crazy. These were usually young men from reasonably comfortable backgrounds who had somehow romanticized the gladiatorial life. They saw the famous gladiators being cheered by the crowds, receiving gifts from admiring women, and becoming celebrities. They didn't see the brutal training, the horrific injuries, the high mortality rate, and the social stigma. They were idiots, basically, and most of them realized their mistake about 5 minutes into their first day of training. But here's the cruel irony. Whether you were enslaved or volunteered, once you entered the ludus, the difference barely mattered. You swore an oath, the Sacramentum Gladiatorum, that gave your lanista complete control over you. You pledged to endure branding, bondage, flogging, and death, by the sword. Yes, really, that was the actual oath. You literally swore to accept being burned with hot irons, chained up, whipped, and killed. For slaves, this oath was just making official what was already reality. For volunteers, it was the moment when the full horror of their decision hit them. Because once you swore that oath, you were a gladiator, and that meant you were no longer fully human in Roman eyes. You were infamous, marked with infamy, stripped of legal and social rights, categorized alongside prostitutes, actors, and criminals as being beneath the dignity of respectable society. Roman law was very clear about this. Gladiators could not vote, hold office, or testify in court, except under torture, which says something about how much their word was valued. If a gladiator was killed, it wasn't legally murder. It was destruction of property, and the penalty was a fine paid to the owner, not prosecution for taking a human life. A Roman citizen who associated too closely with gladiators could be socially ruined. This social death was, in some ways, worse than the physical danger. You weren't just risking your life, you were losing your place in human society. You became a spectacle, an object, a thing that existed for other people's entertainment. And you could never fully wash that stain away, even if you somehow survived and won your freedom. Let me paint you a picture of your first day. You arrive at the ludus in chains. You're stripped, examined, and branded or tattooed. The mark depends on which school you are assigned to, but the point is the same. You're property now, and property gets marked. The branding is done with a hot iron, and it hurts exactly as much as you'd imagine having your flesh burned would hurt. Then you're assigned to a cell. It's small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, and you'll be sharing it with one or more other gladiators. There's no privacy, no comfort, and no escape. The cell door is heavy iron. The walls are stone, and the only light comes from a small barred window near the ceiling. This is your new home, and you'll spend every night here for however long you survive. Your first meal arrives. It's barley porridge, maybe some beans, perhaps a bit of dried fruit. No meat. Gladiators actually ate a mostly vegetarian diet, heavy on grains and legumes. This wasn't for ethical reasons. It was because the Lanista had discovered through trial and error that this diet built bulk without costing too much. You needed to look impressive in the arena, with visible muscles and a layer of protective fat. The diet was designed to create that physique cheaply. Archaeological studies of gladiator remains have confirmed this, by the way. Analysis of their bones shows a diet very heavy in plant protein and relatively low in animal protein. It also shows that many gladiators had healed fractures, battle injuries, and signs of the brutal physical stress they endured. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That first night in your cell, reality sets in. You're here. This is real. There's no escape, no appeal, no rescue coming. Your old life is over. Your family, if you had one, probably thinks you're dead, and they might be right within a few weeks. The sounds of the ludus at night are terrifying. Men crying, screaming from nightmares, praying to their gods, or simply staring at the walls in silent despair. Some new gladiators don't survive that first night. They find a way to kill themselves, hanging from the bars, smashing their heads against the walls, or simply willing themselves to die. The Romans called it morbid despair, and it was common enough that the ludus had protocols for it. Cells were designed to minimize suicide opportunities. New gladiators were watched closely, and anyone showing signs of giving up was either motivated through beatings, or if that didn't work, disposed of as a bad investment. But let's say you survive the night. Morning comes, and with it, the beginning of your training. You're about to discover that everything you thought you knew about fighting was wrong, and learning the truth is going to hurt more than you can possibly imagine. Chapter 2, Training, where your body breaks and your spirit dies. You are standing in the training yard of the ludus as the sun rises over Rome. Your body aches from sleeping on a hard stone bench in your cell. You're hungry. The barley porridge wasn't nearly enough food for someone your size. You're surrounded by dozens of other gladiators, some new like you, others bearing the scars of arena combat. And in front of you stands the doctors, the trainers who are about to spend the next several months transforming you from a normal human being into a weapon designed to kill, and more importantly, to die entertainingly. Let's be clear about something. Gladiator training was not like modern sports training. It wasn't even like military training. It was specifically designed to prepare you to fight one-on-one combat to the death while wearing restrictive armor and using unfamiliar weapons, all for the entertainment of a bloodthirsty crowd. And the Romans had been perfecting this training for centuries, which meant they knew exactly how to break you down and rebuild you into what they needed. The first thing you learned is that everything you thought you knew about fighting is useless here. If you've been in street fights, forget them. Arena combat has completely different rules and dynamics. If you have military experience, forget that too. Battlefield tactics don't apply to single combat. You're starting from zero, and your instructors are going to make sure you understand that through a combination of verbal abuse, physical punishment, and relentless drilling. Your training begins with the rudis, a wooden practice sword. Not a light wooden sword like a modern practice weapon. A heavy wooden sword, weighted to be actually heavier than the real weapons you'll eventually use. Why? Because the Romans understood that if you train with something heavier, the actual weapon will feel lighter and faster in the arena. It's actually pretty smart, in a brutal kind of way. But before you even get to swing that rudies, you need to learn your stance. And by learn, I mean you're going to stand in the correct position for hours while the doctors walks around, correcting your form with a stick. Not gentle corrections. Hard strikes to any body part that's out of position. Knees not bent enough? Whack. Weight distributed wrong? Whack. Head positioned incorrectly. Whack. The Roman stance for gladiatorial combat was very specific. You fought in a squared position, weight evenly distributed, body angled to minimize your profile to the opponent. Your shield, if you had one, not all gladiator types used shields, was held in a specific way to maximize protection while maintaining mobility. Your weapon was held ready, but not tense. Position for quick strikes or defense as needed. Getting this stance perfect was crucial because everything else built on it. And perfect meant you could hold it, maintain it under stress, move from it naturally, and return to it automatically. This took weeks of practice, during which your legs would burn, your back would ache, and your entire body would scream at you to just sit down for a minute. The doctors didn't care. Hold the stance, perfect it, make it second nature. Once your stance was acceptable, not perfect, that would come later, but acceptable, you began learning basic strikes. And this is where the training became truly brutal, because you weren't just learning to hit. You were learning to hit in a way that would kill a man wearing armor, while you were also wearing armor and being hit back. Roman gladiatorial combat was nothing like the Hollywood version. It wasn't a graceful dance of flashing swords. It was heavy, brutal, grinding combat where men in armor beat each other with weapons until one of them couldn't continue. The strikes you learned were designed for maximum efficiency and lethality. Throat cuts, gut stabs, leg strikes to cripple mobility, shield bashes to create openings, and the coup de grace techniques for finishing a downed opponent. You practiced these strikes against wooden posts, the palus, over and over and over again. Thousands of repetitions until your arms felt like they were going to fall off, until your hands bled from gripping the rudies, until the movements became so automatic that you didn't have to think about them. The doctors would call out combinations: high cut, low stab, shield bash, pivot, defensive stance. You did them until you literally collapsed from exhaustion. And then you did them again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. The training was structured to build both skill and the specific type of conditioning gladiators needed. You weren't training to be a marathon runner or a powerlifter. You were training to fight in short, intense bursts of extreme physical activity while wearing heavy armor and dealing with stress, pain, and fear. This required a very specific type of physical preparation. Strength training involved moving heavy objects, grappling with other gladiators, and weapons drills with weighted equipment. The goal was functional strength, the ability to wear armor, wield weapons, and overpower opponents. You built thick muscles on your arms, shoulders, and chest. Your legs became powerful from the constant footwork drills and from supporting the weight of armor hour after hour. But strength alone wasn't enough. You also needed endurance, the ability to fight through multiple rounds if the crowd wanted a long show, or to survive multiple bouts if there was a large gladiatorial program. So the training included running, jumping, and extended drilling sessions where you had to maintain intensity even as exhaustion set in. Speed and reflexes were trained through partnered drills. You'd face off against another gladiator, both of you with wooden weapons and wicker shields, and practice strike and counter combinations at gradually increasing speeds. The doctors would watch, and if you were too slow, too predictable, or too sloppy, you'd feel their stick across your back or legs. These partnered drills were where the real learning happened, because you weren't just practicing movements. You were learning to read opponents, to recognize the subtle body language that telegraphed an attack, to exploit openings, and to protect your own vulnerabilities. You learned which techniques worked on which types of opponents. You learned how to manage distance and timing. You learned the difference between training and actual combat. Because yes, sometimes these training sessions got real. Accidents happened, tempers flared, the wooden weapons could break bones and crush skulls if they connected wrong. Gladiators died in training. Not often, because that was a waste of the Lanista's investment, but it happened. And sometimes it wasn't entirely an accident. Sometimes a veteran gladiator would decide to teach an overly cocky novice a permanent lesson. Sometimes personal grudges got settled in the training yard. The doctors allowed a certain amount of this. It was part of the process, part of creating the brutal mindset you needed to survive in the arena. But they also intervened if it went too far, because dead gladiators earned no money. Let's talk about the different gladiator types, because not everyone trained the same way. The Romans loved variety in their arena shows, so they developed different classes of gladiators, each with unique armor, weapons, and fighting styles. You might become a murmillo, heavily armored with a large rectangular shield, a short sword, gladius, and a distinctive fish-crested helmet. Murmillos fought defensively, using their superior protection to weather attacks and create openings for lethal strikes. Or a thraex, inspired by Thracian warriors, with a small square shield, a curved sword, psyche, and high greaves protecting the legs. Thraex fighters were more mobile and aggressive, using their curved swords' unique properties to get around opponents' shields. Or a retiarius, the lightest armored type, with no helmet, minimal protection, a weighted net, and a trident. Retiarii relied on speed, distance control, and their unique net to entangle opponents before moving in for the kill with the trident. Or a secutor, the pursuer specifically designed to fight retiarii, with a smooth helmet to prevent net entanglement and heavy armor to weather trident strikes while closing distance. Or any of a dozen other specialized types, each with their own equipment, techniques, and training regimens. Your assignment to a particular type wasn't random. The Lanista and Doctores evaluated your physical attributes and temperament to determine where you'd fit best. Tall, aggressive men might become Thraex. Shorter, stockier men might become Murmillo. Men with good reflexes and speed might become Retiarius. The goal was to maximize your chances of survival and entertainment value, which were really the same thing from the Lanista's perspective. Once assigned, your training became specialized. You learned the specific techniques for your weapon set. You practiced against the types you'd most commonly face. Murmillos fought Thraex, and vice versa. Retiarii fought Secutores, and so on. You learned the strengths and weaknesses of both your own equipment and your opponents. This specialized training was both an advantage and a vulnerability. It made you very good at one specific style of combat, but it also meant you were less adaptable, more predictable, and potentially helpless if forced to fight outside your specialty. It was a calculated trade-off: depth of skill versus breadth of ability. The physical training was brutal, but the psychological preparation was arguably worse. The doctors didn't just need to teach you to fight. They needed to teach you to kill, and more importantly, to be willing to die for the entertainment of the crowd. This required breaking down your natural human reluctance to harm others. They did this through systematic desensitization. You started by killing animals, chickens, pigs, eventually larger animals like dogs or goats. You learned what it felt like to push a blade into living flesh, to feel the resistance and then the give as the weapon penetrated, to see the blood and hear the death sounds and smell the released bowels. Then you watched executions. Criminals were killed in the arena at midday, often in elaborate, brutal ways. You were required to watch these to see what death actually looked like, to become comfortable with the sight of human suffering and death. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was deliberate psychological, on conditioning. Some gladiators never adapted. They could learn the physical skills, but couldn't overcome the mental block against killing another human being. These men didn't last long in the arena. Their hesitation got them killed, or they refused to fight and were executed for cowardice, or they found ways to take their own lives rather than take another's. But most men, given enough time and conditioning, did adapt. Humans are remarkably adaptable, even to terrible circumstances. You learn to compartmentalize, to see your opponents as obstacles rather than people, to focus on technique rather than the human cost. You learn to survive by becoming something less than fully human yourself. The training also included showmanship. Remember, this was entertainment. You needed to know how to play to the crowd, how to acknowledge the editor, the sponsor of the games, often an important politician or the emperor himself, how to make your combat visually appealing. This meant dramatic gestures, acknowledgement of particularly good strikes, and generally making sure the audience got their money's worth. This entertainment aspect was actually life or death important. A gladiator who put on a good show was more likely to be spared if defeated. A gladiator who fought boringly or seemed cowardly was more likely to be killed, even if he technically won the match. Your survival depended not just on your combat skills, but on your ability to make thousands of Romans enjoy watching you risk your life. After months of this training, typically 4 to 6 months for a novice, though veterans continued training between fights, you'd be evaluated. The lanista and doctores would determine if you were ready for the arena. If yes, congratulations. You're about to face the most terrifying experience of your life. If no, you went back to training and kept training until you were ready, or until you were injured too badly to continue. Some gladiators trained for years. Before their first fight, this wasn't cruelty, it was economics. The lanista wanted you to win, or at least to put on such a good show that you'd be spared even in defeat. Rushing you into the arena before you were ready would waste his investment. But eventually, ready or not, your time came. Because all the training in the world couldn't fully prepare you for what was about to happen. The heat of the sand, the roar of the crowd, the knowledge that this was real and someone was actually trying to kill you. These were things you could only learn by experiencing them. And the first time you experienced them, you understood with perfect clarity why you wouldn't have survived this life. Because even if you somehow made it through the training, which would have broken most modern people physically and mentally, the arena itself was a completely different kind of hell. Chapter 3. Living Conditions. Your cell is now your world. You are lying on a stone bench in your cell at night, trying to sleep despite the sounds of other gladiators coughing, snoring, weeping, or having nightmares. Your body aches from the day's training. Your hands are blistered and bleeding. You're hungry despite the evening meal, which was the same barley porridge you've been eating every day for months. The cell is cold. It's winter in Rome, and there's no heating except the body warmth of your cellmate, who smells about as bad as you do since baths are infrequent. Welcome to your new normal. The ludus where you live is not a home. It's not even really a prison in the modern sense. It's a warehouse for human weapons, designed to keep you alive and training ready, while providing absolutely minimal comfort or dignity. Let's explore what daily life was actually like in these places, because understanding the living conditions is crucial to understanding why you wouldn't survive this experience. The typical ludus was a rectangular complex built around a central training yard. The cells were arranged around the perimeter, usually on multiple levels, with thick walls and iron-barred doors that could be locked from the outside. Your cell, as mentioned, was roughly 8 by 10 feet, about the size of a small bathroom in a modern house. It contained stone benches for sleeping, no mattresses, maybe some straw if you were lucky, a bucket for waste, and nothing else. No chairs, no tables, no personal possessions, beyond maybe a small bag for your few belongings. You shared this space with at least one other gladiator, sometimes more depending on how crowded the ludus was. Privacy was non-existent. You slept, ate, defecated, and endured your physical and emotional pain in front of your cellmate, and he did the same in front of you. This forced intimacy created strange bonds. Some cellmates became closer than brothers, sharing everything, and watching each other's backs in training and in the arena. Others became bitter enemies, trapped in a space too small to escape each other, their mutual hatred, adding one more layer of misery to an already miserable existence. The walls were thick stone, designed to prevent escape and muffle sound. They didn't muffle it enough. You could hear everything happening in adjacent cells and throughout the ludus. The sounds of men training, arguing, fighting, crying, or being punished were constant. At night, the nightmares started. Gladiators who had fought in the arena would relive their experiences, screaming in their sleep, calling out for dead comrades, or simply making the sounds of animals in pain. Sleep, real sleep, was hard to come by. The cells had small barred windows near the ceiling, too high and too small to escape through, but just enough to provide minimal light and ventilation. In summer, these cells became ovens, the thick stone walls absorbing and radiating heat until you felt like you were being slowly cooked. In winter, they became ice boxes, the stone retaining cold until your breath, frosted, and you huddled for warmth. There was no climate control, no way to make yourself comfortable. You endured because you had no choice. Sanitation was primitive at best. Each cell had a bucket for human waste, which was emptied once or twice a day by slaves, whose job was even worse than yours. If you can imagine that, the bucket didn't prevent the smell. It just concentrated it in one place. The entire ludus had a permanent odor of sweat, urine, feces, and the particular smell of men living in close quarters without adequate hygiene. You stopped noticing it after a while. The same way you stopped noticing the constant aches and pains, it just became part of your reality. Baths existed in most ludi, but they weren't the luxurious affairs you might imagine from movies about Rome. They were communal, utilitarian, and infrequent. You might bathe once or twice a week in water that dozens of other gladiators had already used, getting not quite clean before returning to your cell to get dirty and sweaty again. The baths were also where hierarchies were enforced. Veteran gladiators bathed first in the cleanest water. Novices got the dregs. If you didn't follow this protocol, you'd be reminded of your place, usually painfully. The food deserves special attention because it was both crucial to your survival and deeply unpleasant. The gladiator diet was designed to build bulk and maintain strength while keeping costs down. You ate primarily barley porridge. Hordeari, they called you. Barley men, and it wasn't a compliment. The porridge was supplemented with beans, lentils, occasional vegetables, dried fruit, and sometimes bone ash for calcium. Wait, bone ash? Yes, bone ash. The Romans had figured out empirically that adding calcium to the diet helped bones heal faster and made them stronger, which was useful when your job involved having bones broken on a regular basis. So your porridge sometimes had ground-up bones mixed in. Delicious. Meat was rare, usually reserved for special occasions, or as a reward for particularly successful gladiators. This wasn't cruelty, it was practical. The vegetarian diet created the physique the Romans wanted. Visible muscle mass for show, with a layer of fat underneath for protection. Fat could absorb the impact of strikes and prevent cuts from going too deep. You needed to look impressive and be hard to kill, and the diet was engineered to produce that result. The portions were generous enough to maintain your size and strength, but you were always a little hungry, always wanting more. This was deliberate. Hungry men were motivated men, easier to control with rewards of extra food, more desperate to succeed in the arena where victory might mean better rations. Water was available, but not unlimited. You learned to be strategic about when you drank, balancing hydration needs against the limited water supply and the inconvenience of the waste bucket situation. Dehydration was common, especially during intense training or hot weather, and it affected your performance and health in ways that compounded your other challenges. Medical care existed in the ludus because injured gladiators can't fight, and dead gladiators earn no money. Larger ludi had dedicated medical staff, sometimes even respected physicians who found the study of traumatic injuries fascinating. But the medical care was focused on getting you back to fighting condition as quickly as possible, not on your comfort or long-term health. Injuries were common. In training, You might get broken bones, dislocated joints, deep bruises, or worse. The medical staff would set bones, stitch cuts, and prescribe rest, but not much rest because training had to continue. You learned to fight through pain, to function with injuries that would sideline a modern athlete for weeks or months. Pain became normal, something you acknowledged but didn't let stop you. The medical care, such as it was, also revealed the gladiator hierarchy. Starfighters got better care, more attention from the physicians, better remedies, more rest time. Novices and less valuable gladiators got basic care and were expected to get back to training as soon as they could stand. This makes economic sense, but was devastating psychologically, as it constantly reinforced that you were property, valued only for your potential to earn money. Discipline in the ludus was harsh and immediate. The staff included guards who enforced rules with violence. Step out of line, show disrespect, fight with another gladiator outside of approved training, attempt escape, or show any sign of planning rebellion, and you'd be punished. Punishments ranged from beatings to reduced rations, to isolation in special cells, to being sold to worse situations, or simply being killed if you were deemed too problematic to be worth keeping. Escape was nearly impossible. The ludus was designed as a prison, with high walls, locked doors, and guards. Even if you got out of your cell, you'd need to get past multiple security points, over or through walls, and then navigate a city where you'd be immediately recognizable as an escaped gladiator. Remember that brand or tattoo? Plus, where would you go? You had no money, no legal status, and in many cases, no knowledge of the local language or customs. Recaptured escapees faced brutal punishment or execution. Despite these challenges, some gladiators did try to escape. Most were caught and made examples of. A few succeeded and disappeared into history, their fates unknown. The most famous escape attempt was, of course, the Spartacus Rebellion, which we'll discuss more later. But that was exceptional. Most gladiators were too exhausted, too beaten down, too conditioned to obedience, or simply too practical to attempt something with such low odds of success. The psychological environment of the ludus was toxic in ways that are hard to fully convey. You lived in constant fear of pain, injury, and death. You were surrounded by other men who were equally desperate, and who might see you as either ally or threat, depending on circumstances. You had no control over your life. When you trained, what you ate, when you slept, even whether you lived or died. This powerlessness was crushing. Many gladiators developed what we'd now recognize as severe mental health issues: depression, anxiety, PTSD from arena experiences, and various stress-related disorders. The Romans didn't have these concepts or treatments. Men who broke down mentally were seen as weak and dealt with accordingly, either pushed harder to toughen up, discarded as worthless, or sometimes killed as being too damaged to be useful. Some gladiators found ways to cope psychologically. Religion was important. Many prayed to their native gods, to Roman gods, or to syncretic combinations. Some became deeply superstitious, developing rituals and beliefs that gave them a sense of control. Others formed intense bonds with fellow gladiators, creating families of choice to replace the families they'd lost. Still others simply became numb, shutting down emotionally to survive. The social hierarchy within the ludus was complex and brutal. At the top were the star gladiators, men who had survived multiple fights, built reputations, and earned money for their lanista. These men received better treatment, more respect from staff and fellow gladiators, and sometimes actual privileges like better food or slight privacy. Below them were the journeyman fighters, competent but not spectacular, reliable enough to put on a decent show but not famous. They were the middle class of the ludus, treated adequately but not specially. At the bottom were the novices, the injured and the failed, men who hadn't yet proved themselves, men who were recovering from injuries and couldn't train, and men who had shown cowardice or incompetence in the arena. These men were treated as barely human, receiving minimal care and maximum contempt. This hierarchy was enforced through a combination of official policy and gladiator culture. The staff treated different ranks differently, but the gladiators themselves also policed the hierarchy. A novice who didn't show proper respect to veterans would be taught his place, usually painfully. A failed gladiator might be ostracized, denied the social bonds that made life slightly more bearable. Women existed in this world too, though their roles were limited and complicated. Some ludi had female gladiators, gladiatrices, who fought in the arena, though they were rare and often treated more as novelties than serious fighters. More commonly, women entered the ludus as prostitutes, provided by the lanista as a service to his gladiators, and as another revenue source. These women were themselves enslaved, their lives barely better than the gladiators, trapped in the same brutal economic system. The sexual dynamics of the ludus were complicated and often dark. Gladiators were seen as hyper-masculine, violent, and sexually potent. Dangerous men with dangerous sexuality. Some wealthy Roman women were attracted to this, leading to affairs and scandals that moralist writers love to condemn. But for the gladiators themselves, sexuality was often just another form of exploitation or another way to briefly escape their reality. Time moved strangely in the ludus. Days blurred together in a routine of training, eating, sleeping, and waiting. There was no future to plan for. You might die tomorrow. So long-term thinking was pointless. There was no past to dwell on. Those lives were gone, and remembering them just made the present worse. You existed in an eternal present of pain, exhaustion, and waiting for death. Some gladiators kept track of time by their fights. 3 bouts ago, after my first victory, before I got this scar. Others lost track entirely, unable to say how long they'd been in the ludus. Months, years, it all blended into one long nightmare that might end at any moment in the arena. The ludus was designed to break you down and rebuild you as a weapon. The training broke your body and reconstructed it stronger. The living conditions broke your spirit and reconstructed it as something harder, more brutal, capable of killing without hesitation. The social environment broke your humanity and reconstructed you as a performer, an entertainer, a thing that existed for others' pleasure. And if you somehow survived all of this, the training, the living conditions, the psychological warfare, you still had to face the arena itself, because everything up to this point had been preparation. The real test was yet to come, and it was going to be worse than anything you'd experienced so far. But before we get to the arena, let's talk about one more aspect of ludus life that would absolutely destroy you: the waiting, the endless soul-crushing waiting between fights. Gladiatorial games weren't constant. They were special events, sponsored by wealthy individuals or the state, held on specific occasions. This meant that you might train intensively for months, get yourself to peak physical and mental condition, prepare yourself to face death, and then wait. Wait for someone to sponsor games. Wait for your lanista to rent you out. Wait for your name to be chosen for the next event. This waiting was psychologically devastating. The anxiety of knowing a fight was coming, but not knowing when was its own form of torture. Every day you wondered, is today the day? Will I be chosen for the next games? And when the games were announced, but you weren't selected, there was an odd mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that you had more time to live, disappointment that the waiting would continue, that the sword hanging over your head hadn't fallen yet. When you were finally chosen for an upcoming event, the terror began in earnest. You had days or weeks to think about what was coming, to imagine your death in vivid detail, to wonder if you'd be brave or if you'd embarrass yourself by begging for mercy, to think about whether you'd win and have to kill someone, or lose and be at the mercy of the crowd. Sleep became impossible. Your appetite disappeared, even though you needed to maintain your strength. Your training became unfocused as your mind wandered to the upcoming fight. The doctors would try to keep you sharp, but they also knew that the psychological pressure was part of the process. Some men cracked under it, and those men usually didn't survive their bouts. The night before a fight, you'd be moved to holding cells beneath the arena. the same corridor where we started this journey. These cells were even worse than your ludus cell. Smaller, darker, more crowded. You'd spend the night listening to wild animals roaring. They were also kept beneath the arena, waiting for their part in the show, hearing other gladiators praying or vomiting or crying and contemplating your possible death. Some men tried to sleep and couldn't. Others didn't bother trying. Some wrote letters to families they'd never see again, dictating to scribes if they couldn't write. Others spent the night in prayer or meditation, trying to make peace with their gods and their fate. A few spent it with prostitutes, having one last moment of pleasure before possible death. Everyone dealt with the terror differently, but everyone felt it. Morning would come, and with it, the beginning of the game's day. But you wouldn't fight immediately. Gladiatorial combat was the main event, the climax of the day. First came the animal hunts in the morning, then the executions of criminals at midday, and finally, in the afternoon when the crowd was fully engaged, the gladiatorial bouts. So you waited more. You waited while listening to the crowd roar at the animal fights. You waited while hearing the screams of criminals being executed in creative and horrible ways. And you waited knowing that soon, very soon, that crowd would be roaring at you, and you'd either die to their cheers or kill someone else for their entertainment. This is what would break most modern people before they even reached the arena. Not the training, as brutal as it was, not the living conditions, as miserable as they were, but the psychological torture of waiting to die, of having no control over your fate, of knowing that your life would end as a spectacle for people who saw you as less than human. You've been conditioned by modern life to have agency, to make choices, to control your destiny, at least somewhat. The ludus stripped all of that away. You were powerless, helpless, waiting for death, and unable to do anything about it except train to kill or be killed slightly more effectively. That loss of agency, that absolute powerlessness, would destroy your mind long before a sword could destroy your body. Chapter 4. The Arena. Forward. Where entertainment meets death. You are standing in the tunnel beneath the Colosseum, and the gate is opening. Sunlight floods in, momentarily blinding you after the darkness of the holding cells. The roar of the crowd hits you like a physical force. 50,000 people screaming, stamping, chanting. You can smell the blood-soaked sand from previous fights. Your legs feel weak, your mouth is dry, and every instinct in your body is screaming at you to run, to hide, to do anything except walk out into that arena. But you walk anyway, because armed guards behind you make running impossible, because your training has conditioned you to obey, and because deep down, some small part of you still hopes you might survive this. Welcome to the arena. Let's talk about why you won't make it through the next hour. The Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheater as the Romans called it, could hold around 50,000 spectators. Imagine a modern sports stadium, but instead of watching athletes play a game, everyone is here specifically to watch people like you die. And they're not passive viewers. They're engaged, invested, screaming for blood, judging your every move, and ultimately deciding whether you live or die. The arena floor itself is roughly 280 feet long and 175 feet wide, covered in sand. The sand isn't just for aesthetics. It's there to soak up blood, which there will be plenty of. Beneath the sand is the hippodrome, a complex system of tunnels, cages, and mechanical lifts used to bring gladiators, animals, and scenery up to the arena floor. You just came from there, and if you lose this fight, you'll go back down as a corpse. But right now, you're walking out into the sunlight, and the crowd is evaluating you. Are you tall, short, muscular, scarred? Are you moving confidently or showing fear? Are you a known fighter or an anonymous nobody? Every detail matters because the crowd has opinions, and those opinions can determine your fate. The program for gladiatorial games followed a specific structure. You're not the first fight of the day. Those were the warm-up bouts, newer gladiators fighting to build experience and entertain the early arrivals. You're also probably not the main event. That's reserved for the most famous gladiators, the matchups people came specifically to see. You're somewhere in the middle, experienced enough to put on a decent show, but not so famous that your death would be a major loss. Your opponent is already in the arena, or emerges from the opposite gate at the same time as you. You see him across the sand, maybe a murmillo if you're a thrax, maybe a secutor if you're a retiarius, maybe another style entirely. He's as terrified as you are, or he's a veteran who's done this a dozen times and sees you as just another opponent to defeat, or he's a madman who's embraced the violence and actually enjoys it. You can't tell which, and you have about 30 seconds to figure it out before the fight begins. First, there's the ceremony. You must salute the editor, the sponsor of the games, usually a wealthy politician or sometimes the emperor himself, sitting in the place of honor. The traditional salute is accompanied by the phrase Ave, Imperator, Moriturite Salutant. Hail, Emperor! Those who are about to die salute you. Though contrary to popular belief, this wasn't said at every fight. It was originally said by condemned criminals before mass execution, but it got popularized and sometimes gladiators used it too. Mostly, you just raised your weapon in salute and tried not to look as terrified as you felt. Then the weapons check. Officials would verify that your equipment was properly fitted and that the weapons were real and sharp. This inspection served multiple purposes. It ensured the fight would be fair, or at least appear fair. It prevented gladiators from using defective equipment as an excuse if they lost, and it built tension for the crowd as they watched the preparations. And then finally, the signal was given. The fight began. Here's what movies don't show you. Real gladiatorial combat was exhausting, brutal, and surprisingly short. You weren't dancing around for 20 minutes having a sword fight. You were two heavily armed and armored men trying to kill each other as efficiently as possible while putting on enough of a show to satisfy the crowd. If you're a murmillo, you're carrying a large rectangular shield, scutum, that weighs around 22 pounds, a gladius that weighs about 2 to 3 pounds, and wearing a helmet that weighs 15 pounds, arm protection, and a leg greave. Your total equipment weight is around 45 to 50 pounds. In the Italian sun, wearing metal armor, this is like fighting while wearing a backpack full of weights. Within minutes, you're sweating profusely, your breathing is labored, and your arms are starting to burn from holding the shield. Your opponent, let's say he's a thrax, has lighter armor but his own challenges. His small shield provides less protection, forcing him to be more mobile and aggressive. His curved sword is designed to hook around your shield, but it's also shorter than your gladius, putting him at a reach disadvantage. He needs to close the distance without getting impaled, while you need to keep him at bay and create an opening for a kill strike. The fight begins with both of you circling, trying to read each other. Who's more aggressive? Who's more tired? Who has weaknesses in their stance? This evaluation period might last 30 seconds or 3 minutes, depending on your styles and the crowd's patience. The crowd, by the way, is not patient. If you're both circling without engaging, they'll start booing, throwing things, screaming insults. They paid for blood, and they want to see it now. So you engage. The initial clash is violent and desperate. Shield against shield, weapons striking armor and shields, both of you trying to create an opening while protecting yourself. The noise is incredible. Metal on metal. The crowd roaring, you and your opponent grunting with effort. Your heart is pounding so hard you can feel it in your throat. Adrenaline makes everything feel surreal, like you're watching yourself from outside your body. Here's where your training either saves you or fails you. In the chaos of real combat, you default to your most practiced responses. If your training was thorough, your body reacts correctly without conscious thought. You block automatically, counterinstinctively, maintain your stance naturally. If your training was inadequate or you're too frozen with fear to apply it, you make mistakes. And in gladiatorial combat, mistakes are fatal. Let's say you make a mistake. You overextend on a strike, and your opponent's sword gets past your shield. You feel the impact. Metal cutting through padding, then skin, then muscle. The pain is intense and immediate, but the adrenaline keeps you fighting. You're bleeding, your arm doesn't work. quite right anymore, but you can't stop because stopping means dying. Or maybe your opponent makes the mistake. You see an opening. His shield is out of position for just a moment. Your training takes over. You thrust with your gladius, aiming for the throat, the armpit, the groin, anywhere the armor is weak. You feel the resistance as your blade enters flesh, the strange sensation of metal sliding between ribs or cutting through soft tissue. Your opponent makes a sound, surprise, pain, fear. And you see the moment when he realizes he's been mortally wounded, but he's not dead yet. Mortal wounds don't kill instantly except in movies. He's still fighting, now with the desperation of a man who knows he's dying. He might fight harder now, throwing everything into a final assault, knowing he has nothing to lose. Or he might weaken rapidly as blood loss and shock set in, his movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated. The fight might last 2 minutes or 20, depending on skill levels, equipment types, and how much the crowd is enjoying it. The editor might signal for a pause if the fight is particularly good and he wants to draw it out, giving you both water and a chance to catch your breath before continuing. Or he might push for a quick resolution if the fight is boring or if there are many more bouts scheduled. Eventually, one of you goes down. Let's explore both possibilities, because your survival depends on understanding what happens next. Possibility 1. Your opponent goes down. He's wounded, maybe mortally, maybe not. He's on his knees or lying on the sand, unable to continue fighting. This is where the famous thumbs up or thumbs down gesture comes from. Except that's not actually what happened. The Roman gesture for mercy was more complex and debated by historians, but essentially, the defeated gladiator could appeal to the crowd for mercy by raising a finger. The crowd's response would guide the editor's decision. If they wanted him spared because he fought bravely, because he's a popular fighter, because they enjoyed the show, they'd wave handkerchiefs, shout for mercy, or make the appropriate gesture. If they wanted him killed, because he fought like a coward, because the show was boring, because they just wanted more blood, they'd turn their thumbs. The direction is debated, but the meaning is clear. The editor would then give his judgment. If the thumb pointed down, or in whatever direction meant death, you had to deliver the coup de grace. This meant kneeling on your opponent's body, forcing him to lie flat, and driving your sword into his throat or chest. You had to kill him efficiently, and in a way that looked good for the crowd. This was part of your training, practiced on dummies and animals, but doing it to a man who moments ago was trying to kill you is different. You do it anyway, because refusing means you'll be executed for cowardice. The killing blow is supposed to be quick, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you miss the vital spots, and your opponent thrashes and bleeds out slowly while the crowd watches. Sometimes he begs, and you have to ignore the pleas and finish the job. Sometimes he dies stoically, maintaining his dignity to the end, and you feel a strange respect for this man you just killed. If mercy is granted, you help him up. The crowd cheers and he gets to live, at least until the next fight. You've survived, you've won, and you get to go back to the ludus. But you've also just killed a man, or at least wounded him severely, and that's something you'll carry with you forever. Possibility 2. You go down. You're wounded or exhausted, or you made a critical mistake, and now you're on the sand, unable to fight back effectively. Your opponent is standing over you, weapon raised, waiting for the signal. This is the moment where you find out if you're going to live or die. You can appeal for mercy by raising your finger, but you have no control over what happens next. The crowd evaluates your performance. Did you fight well? Were you brave? Did you put on a good show? If yes, they might call for mercy. If no, they want to see you die, and they'll make that very clear. The terror of this moment is indescribable. You're lying on blood-soaked sand, wounded, exhausted, looking up at thousands of strangers who are casually deciding whether you should live or die based on how entertaining you were while fighting for your life. Your survival depends on the whims of people who don't know you, don't care about you, and see you as an object for their entertainment. If the verdict is death, your opponent delivers the killing blow. You're supposed to face it bravely. Show no fear, no begging. Maintain your dignity to the end. This was considered important in Roman culture. A gladiator who died well, with courage and composure, earned respect even in death. A gladiator who begged or panicked was scorned and mocked, but maintaining dignity while someone is about to stab you in the throat is easier said than done. Some men managed it, others didn't. The crowd judged you for this too, adding one final insult to your death. The actual moment of death varied. A sword through the heart or throat killed relatively quickly, unconsciousness within seconds, death within a minute or two. Other wounds took longer. The Romans sometimes had attendants dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the dead, who would verify that defeated gladiators were actually dead, clubbing them with a hammer if they were still alive. Yes, really. If the sword didn't kill you fast enough, they'd finish the job with blunt force trauma to ensure you were dead before your body was dragged off. Speaking of which, after death, your body was dragged off the sand through the Porta Libitinensis, the gate of the goddess of death. Your corpse was stripped of any valuable equipment and then disposed of. No ceremony, no burial honors, no dignity. You were literally dragged off like garbage because that's all you were to the Romans, an object that had served its purpose and was now waste to be disposed of. If you survived, you walked off through the Porta Sanavivaria, the gate of life. But don't imagine a hero's welcome. You walked back to the ludus, back to your cell, to wait for the next fight. Your wounds would be treated, you'd rest and recover, and then you'd train again, knowing that eventually you'd be back in the arena. Now let's talk about the things that could go wrong that have nothing to do with your opponent's skill. The heat was brutal. Fighting in metal armor under the Italian sun in summer could cause heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Gladiators sometimes collapsed from heat before their opponent even touched them. If you passed out from heat, you were defenseless, and the crowd typically wanted you killed for putting on such a boring show. The sand could be treacherous. Blood, sweat, and previous fighting made it slippery and unpredictable. You could slip, lose your footing, and create an opening for your opponent. This happened frequently enough that skilled gladiators learned to use the sand conditions strategically, forcing opponents into areas with poor footing. Equipment could fail. A strap could break, a helmet could shift and block your vision, a shield could split. These weren't common. Equipment was checked carefully, but they happened. And when they did, you were suddenly fighting with a severe handicap. Injuries from previous fights could resurface. That shoulder you dislocated last month and thought had healed. It gives out under the stress of combat. That rib that was cracked. The pain makes it hard to breathe deeply, affecting your stamina. Your body was a patchwork of old injuries, and any of them could betray you at the worst possible moment. The psychological pressure could break you. Some gladiators simply froze when facing actual death. All. Their training disappeared, replaced by pure terror. They stood there, unable to fight back, while their opponent killed them. The crowd had no sympathy for this. They saw it as cowardice and demanded death. The arena also hosted more complex spectacles than simple one-on-one combat. Sometimes there were group battles, multiple gladiators fighting simultaneously, either free-for-all or team-based. These were even more chaotic and dangerous than single combat. You had to track multiple opponents, coordinate with allies who might betray you, and deal with the unpredictability of complex combat. Sometimes the arena floor was flooded for naumachia, naval battles. Yes, they actually flooded the arena and fought mock sea battles with real ships and real killing. If you were involved in these, you had all the regular dangers of gladiatorial combat, plus the risks of drowning, being crushed by ship debris, or any of the other nautical hazards. Sometimes they created elaborate sets for themed battles. Forests with real trees, buildings, even mechanical devices. These thematic battles were visually impressive, but added new dangers. You might be fighting in terrain you'd never trained in, using tactics that didn't quite work in the new environment, all while the crowd expected you to make it look good. And let's not forget the animal hunts. While technically separate from gladiatorial combat, Some gladiators were also used in Venetia, fighting wild animals. Bears, lions, leopards, even elephants were brought to the arena. Fighting a human opponent is terrifying enough. Fighting a lion is a whole different level of nightmare. Animals don't follow human combat logic. They're unpredictably fast and strong, and they'll kill you in ways your training never prepared you for. The psychological aftermath of surviving a fight was its own form of torture. You'd killed someone, or at least tried to. You'd come within inches of dying yourself. You'd seen and caused terrible violence. The Romans had no concept of PTSD or combat trauma, but you experienced it anyway. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the sudden panic at loud noises, the difficulty connecting with people, all of this was waiting for you back in your cell, and you knew you'd have to do it again. This wasn't a one-time ordeal. This was your life now. Fight, recover, train, fight again, each time hoping you'd survive, each time knowing your luck would run out eventually. The average gladiator fought perhaps 3 to 5 times per year, depending on how successful they were and how many games were held. Some fought more, some less, but each fight was another roll of the dice, another chance of death. The crowd's reaction to your performance affected everything. Win or lose, if you put on a good show, you earned respect and fame. You might receive gifts from wealthy admirers, extra food from your lanista, even monetary rewards. Your market value increased, meaning you were treated slightly better because you were worth more. But if you fought poorly, whether you won or lost, you earned nothing but contempt. The crowd would remember you as boring or cowardly, and next time you fought, they'd be hoping to see you die. This social pressure was immense. You had to be brave and entertaining while fighting for your life, because your future survival depended on making thousands of strangers enjoy watching you bleed. Some gladiators became genuine celebrities. They had fan clubs, received love letters and gifts from admirers, and were recognized on the streets. Their names were written on walls throughout Rome, often alongside lewd suggestions from admiring women. But this fame was double-edged. Famous gladiators were more likely to be spared when defeated, but they were also expected to fight more often and against more dangerous opponents. The crowd wanted to see the best fight the best, and your fame made you a target. The politics of the games were also complex. Sometimes matches were fixed. Lanistas would arrange for one gladiator to win, perhaps because he was more valuable or because there were gambling interests involved. If you were told to lose, you had to make it look good while still losing. This was dangerous. You had to let your opponent win without making it obvious to the crowd, and you had to trust that the mercy verdict would be given as arranged. Fixed fights went wrong sometimes, with disastrous results. The ultimate goal for many gladiators was to win enough fights to earn the rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom. After a certain number of victories, the number varied. A successful gladiator might be granted his freedom and allowed to retire. The rudis ceremony would happen in the arena, in front of the crowd, as a reward for exceptional service. But here's the dark reality. Most gladiators never earned the rudis. They died in the arena long before accumulating enough victories, and even those who did earn freedom often had nowhere to go. They had no money, no skills except killing, and the social stigma of having been a gladiator. Many freedmen gladiators ended up working for ludi as trainers, or returned to fighting voluntarily because they knew nothing else. The arena destroyed you, whether you won or lost. If you lost, you died. If you won, you survived to fight again, carrying the physical and psychological scars of what you'd done and what had been done to you. There was no winning, really. Just different types of losing. Chapter 5. The social reality. You're less than human, now you're walking through the streets of Rome after surviving your first arena fight. Your wounds have healed enough that you're mobile, and your lanesta has given you rare permission to leave the ludus for a few hours, a reward for your victory, and a chance to increase your visibility and marketability. You should feel proud. You survived. You're a gladiator who won his first fight. But as you walk, you notice how people react to you. Some stare with fascination. You're a curiosity, a dangerous animal safely observed from a distance. Some women look at you with a mixture of fear and arousal that makes you uncomfortable. But most respectable Romans look away, their faces showing disgust or disdain. Shopkeepers watch you carefully, hands on their goods, making sure you don't steal. Children are pulled away by their parents. You're famous, yes, but you're also reviled. Welcome to the social reality of being a gladiator. Let's discuss why even surviving the arena wouldn't save you from a life of misery. Roman society had strict hierarchies, and gladiators occupied one of the lowest rungs. The legal term infamus literally meant lacking fame, or without reputation, but it effectively meant you had no legal or social standing. You were categorized alongside prostitutes, actors, pimps, and convicted criminals as being unworthy of participation in respectable society. This wasn't just social snobbery, it had real legal consequences. As a gladiator, you couldn't vote in elections, couldn't hold public office, couldn't serve on juries. Your testimony in court was considered unreliable unless given under torture. And yes, that means they'd torture you to get testimony because they assumed you'd lie otherwise. If someone murdered you, it wasn't prosecuted as murder. It was destruction of property, and your owner might receive financial compensation, but that was it. You also couldn't legally marry a citizen of higher status. If you somehow fell in love with a respectable Roman woman, that relationship could ruin her social standing, and was often illegal. This didn't stop some women from pursuing gladiators, but those relationships were scandals, conducted in secret and condemned by society. The Roman moralists wrote extensively about the problem of women being attracted to gladiators. They were horrified and fascinated by it in equal measure. How could respectable women be drawn to these vile, violent men? The answer, of course, was that gladiators represented forbidden danger, raw masculinity, and transgressive excitement. But for you, as the gladiator, these relationships were complicated at best and exploitative at worst. Wealthy women might seek you out for affairs, but you were still property. You had no right to refuse. If your lanista decided to loan you out as entertainment for a wealthy patron, and that entertainment included sexual services, you complied or faced punishment. Your body wasn't your own. It existed for others' pleasure, whether that pleasure was watching you fight or using you sexually. Male gladiators were also seen as sexually available to wealthy men. Roman attitudes toward sexuality were complex and based more on power dynamics than gender. A wealthy Roman man using a gladiator sexually wasn't considered problematic from his perspective. You were an inferior, and using inferiors was expected. But for you, it was yet another way you were dehumanized and exploited. The social stigma affected every interaction. When you entered a tavern, the atmosphere changed. Regular customers might leave, not wanting to associate with someone of your status. Or they might crowd around, wanting to hear war stories from the arena, treating you like a performing animal rather than a person. You could never just exist normally. You were always a spectacle, always defined by your role as a gladiator. Children were fascinated by gladiators, but also taught to look down on them. Toys and games featured gladiator figures. It was popular entertainment, but parents also used gladiators as cautionary tales. Behave, or you'll end up like them. The same way modern parents might say, stay in school, or you'll end up in a dead-end job. Roman parents would say, study your lessons, or you'll end up in the arena. The contradiction was stark. Gladiators were simultaneously celebrated and reviled. The crowd cheered for you in the arena, memorized your fighting style, bought merchandise with your image, wrote your name on walls. But those same people wouldn't want their daughters to marry you, wouldn't invite you to their dinner parties, wouldn't consider you fully human. Famous gladiators could earn significant money through prize winnings, gifts from admirers, and endorsement deals. Yes, Roman gladiators did endorsements. Their images appeared on pottery, lamps, and various goods. But wealth couldn't buy respectability. A wealthy gladiator was still a gladiator, still infamous, still socially unacceptable in respectable circles. Some gladiators tried to escape the stigma through retirement, If you survived long enough to earn the rudies and your freedom, you could theoretically start a new life. But the brand or tattoo marking you as a former gladiator was permanent. Everyone could see what you'd been, and the skills you'd developed, killing people efficiently, weren't particularly transferable to normal careers. Many freed gladiators became trainers at Ludi, passing on their knowledge to the next generation of fighters. This kept them connected to the only world they understood, but it also meant they never truly escaped. Others became bodyguards for wealthy Romans who wanted intimidating protection and didn't care about social niceties. A few became successful businessmen, but they always faced discrimination and suspicion. The psychological damage of social exclusion compounded the physical and mental trauma of arena fighting. You were constantly reminded that you were less than human, that your life had less value, that no matter what you accomplished, you'd never be truly accepted. This isolation was profound and corrosive. Some gladiators formed fierce bonds with each other, brother gladiators who understood the shared experience and provided the only real community available. These friendships were deep and genuine, born from shared trauma and mutual understanding, but they were also constantly threatened by the fact that you might have to fight and kill each other in the arena. The social structure within the gladiatorial world was its own complex hierarchy. Famous gladiators were at the top. They had respect from their peers, better treatment from lanistas, and relative security. Below them were the reliable journeyman fighters. At the bottom were the newcomers and the failures. This internal hierarchy provided structure and meaning in a world that denied you external status. Religious life offered some solace. Many gladiators were deeply religious, praying to various gods for protection, victory, or a good death. Some worshipped the traditional Roman gods, others the gods of their homelands, others syncretic combinations. The Roman religious system was flexible enough to accommodate various beliefs, and the gods didn't care about social status. Prayers from a gladiator were as valid as prayers from a senator. Gladiator cults and religious associations existed where fighters could gather, share meals, and participate in religious ceremonies. These organizations provided community and a sense of belonging that was otherwise denied. They were one of the few spaces where gladiators could exist as something other than entertainment objects. But even religion couldn't fully compensate for social exclusion. You were still less than human in the eyes of Roman society, and nothing could change that as long as you remained a gladiator. The treatment of gladiator corpses illustrated this dehumanization. After death in the arena, your body was stripped of valuables and disposed of without ceremony. You weren't given proper funeral rites, weren't buried with honor. Your corpse might be thrown into a mass grave, fed to animals, or simply dumped. Your life had value only as entertainment. In death, you were worthless. Some gladiators arranged with their fellows to ensure proper burial if they died. These agreements, if I die, make sure I'm buried properly and my family is notified, were honored when possible, but often weren't feasible. The ludus might not allow it, or there might not be funds for it, or your fellow gladiators might have died themselves before they could fulfill the promise. The legal vulnerability was also severe. Because you had no real legal standing, you could be abused with impunity. If a Roman citizen assaulted you on the street, you had no legal recourse. If you were cheated by a merchant, no court would hear your case. If someone stole from you, there was no justice available. You existed outside the protection of law, vulnerable to any abuse anyone chose to inflict. This vulnerability extended to arbitrary punishment. Your lanista could beat you, starve you, sell you, or kill you for any reason or no reason. You had no appeals process, no protection, no rights. If you complained, you'd be punished more, severely. Your only option was to endure and hope for better treatment. The economic exploitation was systematic. While successful gladiators could earn prize money, most of it went to their lanista. You might receive a small portion, enough to buy minor comforts or save toward eventual freedom, but the majority of your earnings enriched your owner. You were generating wealth through your blood and risk, but seeing little of it yourself. Even voluntary gladiators who had signed contracts found those contracts were exploitative. The terms were generally favorable to the lanista, and once signed, you had little ability to renegotiate. You'd sold yourself into this situation, and now you were trapped in it, unable to extract fair value for your life-risking labor. The social stigma also affected your relationships with family, if you had any surviving family. If you'd been enslaved as a prisoner of war, your family back home probably thought you were dead. If you'd volunteered, your family might be ashamed of your choice. Roman families of gladiators faced social consequences. They were associated with your infamy, looked down upon by their communities, possibly ostracized. Some families disowned gladiators entirely, cutting all ties to avoid the social taint. Others maintained contact in secret, visiting the ludus when possible, sending messages, trying to maintain some connection despite the shame. These relationships were complicated by distance, social pressure, and the likelihood that you wouldn't survive long enough to ever reunite with your family. Children of gladiators inherited some of the social stigma. They weren't legally barred from citizenship or advancement the way their gladiator parent was, but they faced discrimination and prejudice. Growing up as the gladiator's kid meant dealing with bullying, social exclusion, and limited opportunities. Your existence as a gladiator cursed not just you, but potentially your descendants. The intersection of social stigma and arena performance created a vicious cycle. You had to fight well to survive, but fighting well meant becoming more famous, which meant more fights against more dangerous opponents. Success didn't lead to safety. It led to more risk. And all the while, you remained socially despised, no matter how successful you became. Some emperors were fascinated by gladiatorial combat and participated in it themselves, despite the social stigma. Commodus famously fought in the arena hundreds of times, but even as emperor, his participation was scandalous and undermined his authority in the eyes of respectable Romans. If even the emperor couldn't overcome the stigma of gladiatorial combat, what hope did you have? The propaganda value of gladiatorial games was significant. Emperors and wealthy politicians sponsored games to win popularity and demonstrate their power and generosity. They were providing entertainment, yes, but also reinforcing social hierarchies. The games showed that the powerful could command life and death, that they could provide spectacle and bread for the masses. And you, the gladiator, were a tool in this political theater. Your suffering was entertainment, yes, but it was also propaganda. It showed what happened to Rome's enemies if you were a prisoner of war, what happened to criminals if you'd been convicted of a crime, or what desperate people would do for money if you'd volunteered. The games reinforced the Roman social order by displaying the consequences of being on the wrong side of that order. Some philosophers and moralists criticized gladiatorial games as debasing and brutal. Seneca wrote about how attending the games made spectators more callous and violent. Cicero questioned whether it was appropriate for civilized people to enjoy watching human suffering. But these criticisms were minority views, and they didn't stop the games from continuing for centuries. Even critics often framed their objections in terms of what the games did to spectators, not what they did to gladiators. Your suffering was less important than whether watching you suffer was good or bad for Roman citizens. You remained an object in these debates, not a subject with your own legitimate grievances. The social reality of being a gladiator meant that even if you survived the arena, you'd never have a normal life. You'd never be fully accepted, never be safe from exploitation, and never be seen as fully human by the society you lived in. The arena might be where you could die, but the social stigma was what killed your spirit, your dignity, and any hope of a meaningful existence beyond violence. Chapter 6: The Brutal Mathematics of Survival. You are lying in your cell at night, and you're doing the math. You've survived 3 fights. The average gladiator fights maybe 3 to 5 times per year. Most gladiators don't survive past their first 5 fights. If you keep fighting at this rate, you might have 2 years left. Maybe 3 if you're lucky. Probably less. This is the brutal mathematics of gladiatorial survival. And understanding these numbers makes clear why you wouldn't make it as a gladiator. Let's break down the statistics of death. Modern historical research, based on analysis of gladiatorial records, tombstones, and ancient accounts, suggests that mortality rates for gladiators were high, but not as universally fatal as Hollywood suggests. Estimates vary, but roughly 10 to 20% of gladiatorial combats ended in death. This sounds almost reasonable until you do the math on repeated exposure. If each fight has a 15% chance of death, surviving one fight isn't too unlikely. But surviving 5 fights, the probability drops to about 44%. 10 fights, about 20%. 20 fights, less than 4%. The mathematics are brutal. Each fight you survive makes the next one statistically more likely to kill you, simply because your luck has to hold again and again and again. And these numbers are optimistic. They're averaged across all gladiators, including the stars who fought carefully managed fights against beatable opponents. For you, an average gladiator without special protection or fame, the odds are worse, much worse. Let's break down all the ways the odds are stacked against you. First, matchmaking. If you're a successful gladiator, you'll be matched against increasingly difficult opponents. Promoters wanted competitive fights, not boring one-sided slaughters. Usually, more on that in a moment. So every victory makes your next fight harder. You beat an average opponent? Great. Next time you fight a good opponent. Beat a good opponent? Now you face a great one. Eventually, you face someone better than you, and that's where your winning streak ends. If you're unsuccessful, if you lose but are spared, your next fight is also dangerous because you've been identified as beatable. Opponents know they can defeat you, the crowd expects you to lose, and the pressure to put on a good show is even higher because you need to redeem yourself. The only semi-safe category is the reliable journeyman. Neither star nor failure, just consistently adequate. But even these gladiators face regular danger. And one bad day, one moment of bad luck, one superior opponent, and they're dead. Second, cumulative damage. Your body doesn't fully recover between fights. That cracked rib doesn't heal completely before you're training again. The concussion from a helmet blow leaves you with lingering headaches and slower reactions. The sword wound that healed still aches in cold weather. Each fight adds to your accumulated damage, and this accumulation degrades your performance, making each subsequent fight more dangerous. Modern athletes have sports medicine, physical therapy, extended off seasons for recovery. You have basic medical care, and then back to training. Your body is literally breaking down under the stress, and this degradation accelerates your path to death. Third, age and decline. Peak physical condition for a gladiator was probably mid-20s to early 30s. Before that, you might lack experience and full physical development. After that, you're getting slower, weaker, less able to recover from injury. The older gladiators were generally veterans with experience advantages, but they were also fighting younger, faster opponents. Eventually, age catches up with everyone. If you started as a gladiator in your early 20s, survived to your 30s, you'd be an old man by gladiatorial standards. Your body would be covered in scars. Joints would be degrading from repeated trauma. You'd be slower and more easily tired. At some point, even if you'd won dozens of fights, someone younger and faster would kill you. Fourth, psychological breakdown. The mental toll of repeated combat, of killing people, of nearly dying, of the constant stress and fear. This accumulates, just like physical damage. Modern soldiers in extended combat develop PTSD. You're experiencing the same thing, but the Romans have no concept of it, no treatment for it, no way to help you cope. Some gladiators became alcoholics, using wine to numb the psychological pain. Others became increasingly reckless, taking unnecessary risks because they'd lost the fear that kept them careful. Others simply broke mentally, unable to function, and these men died quickly in subsequent fights. Fifth, random chance. You could do everything right and still die to bad luck. You slip on blood-soaked sand at the wrong moment. Your equipment fails. You get matched against an opponent who happens to be your worst stylistic matchup. You catch an illness between fights. that weakens you just enough to make a difference. The crowd is in a bloodthirsty mood and demands death even after a good fight. Random chance is always a factor, and the more you fight, the more opportunities randomness has to kill you. Let's talk about some specific numbers from the historical record. We have records of gladiators who fought and survived dozens of bouts. These were the exceptional cases, the stars, the survivors. Their tombstones and records were kept because they were remarkable. But for every gladiator with 50 fights, there were hundreds who died in their first, second, or third bout and left no record at all. We also have records of large gladiatorial events. The opening of the Colosseum involved games that lasted 100 days and killed thousands of people, gladiators and others. Emperor Trajan's Dacian triumph featured games with 10,000 gladiators fighting. Not all of these fights were to the death, but many were, and the mortality numbers were staggering. The economic incentives were complex. Lanistas didn't want their investments killed unnecessarily. Training gladiators was expensive, and dead gladiators earned no future revenue. This pressure meant that some fights were less deadly than they could have been, with more defeated gladiators being spared, but this economic protection only went so far. If the crowd demanded death, the editor would often grant it, because public opinion mattered more than a Lanista's property rights. Emperors and wealthy sponsors sometimes pushed for deadlier games to satisfy the bloodlust of the crowd and demonstrate their power and generosity. Games without quarter, where no mercy was granted, were periodically held, and these were death sentences for approximately half the participants. The training mortality also needs to be factored in. Some gladiators died in training before ever reaching the arena. Accidents happened, medical care failed, suicide claimed some, and occasionally gladiators were simply killed by trainers or other gladiators. If you include training deaths, the overall mortality rate for men entering the gladiatorial system was even higher than arena deaths alone suggest. Then there are the non-combat deaths. Disease killed gladiators just like it killed everyone else in ancient Rome. The close quarters of the ludus, the stress and exhaustion, the injuries that became infected, all of this made gladiators vulnerable to illness. An epidemic sweeping through a ludus could kill dozens before it ran its course. Malnutrition and poor living conditions contributed to health problems. The gladiator diet, while adequate for building bulk, wasn't ideal for overall health. Vitamin deficiencies, digestive problems, and nutritional imbalances all took their toll. Combined with the physical stress of training and fighting, these issues shortened lives and reduced the body's ability to heal from injuries. Suicide was a constant presence. Some gladiators killed themselves rather than face another fight. Others took their lives after losing, but before the killing blow, denying the crowd the satisfaction. Still others simply gave up, stopped fighting back in the arena, and let their opponent kill them. These deaths were considered shameful, but they were also rational choices, made by men who saw no other way out of unbearable circumstances. The math on earning freedom through victory was also discouraging. To earn the rudies, you generally needed an exceptional record. Many victories, good performances, crowd favor. For most gladiators, this was an impossible standard. You'd be killed by an accumulation of probabilities long before you racked up enough wins to earn freedom. Even successful gladiators faced the reality that one bad day would erase years of success. You could win 20 fights, become famous, start believing you might actually survive this, and then fight 21, slip at the wrong moment, and die on the sand like any novice. There was no guaranteed safety, no level of success that protected you completely. The veterans who survived dozens of fights did so through some combination of exceptional skill, careful fight selection, crowd favor, and extraordinary luck. But they were the rare exceptions, the lottery winners of the gladiatorial world. For every veteran with 30 victories, there were hundreds of gladiators buried in unmarked graves after 1, 2, or 3 fights. Some gladiators were kept as safe fighters, men who fought frequent bouts against carefully selected opponents they were likely to beat. These exhibition fighters were profitable because they won consistently and could fight often without high risk of death. But even these relatively protected gladiators eventually ran into someone who beat them, or they aged out and became too slow to compete safely. The promises of glory and wealth that lured some volunteers into the profession were largely empty. Yes, a few gladiators became wealthy and famous, but the vast majority lived in squalor, died young, and left nothing behind but scattered bones, and maybe a name scratched on a wall by an admiring fan who never knew them as people. The brutal mathematics make clear that gladiatorial combat wasn't sustainable as a long-term career. It was a death sentence with a variable execution date. You could delay death through skill and luck, but you couldn't escape it. Eventually, the probabilities caught up with everyone, and you'd die on the sand. Just another statistic. Just another body dragged through the gate of death for you. A modern person with no combat training, no conditioning to violence, no experience with the specific skills required, and no mental preparation for the brutality of the arena. Your odds would be even worse than these already terrible statistics. Your first fight would probably be your last. And even if you somehow won, the second fight would get you, or the third, or the 10th. The mathematics are undefeatable. You cannot win this game. Chapter 7. Famous Gladiators and Rebellions. When the weapons turned on their masters. You are sitting in your cell, and another gladiator is telling you stories about the legendary fighters, about Spartacus, who led a rebellion that terrified Rome, about Flamma, who refused freedom 4 times to keep fighting, about Spiculus, who was so favored by Emperor Nero that he received palaces and wealth. These stories give you hope. Maybe you could become legendary too. Maybe you could be the exception. But let's talk about what these stories actually reveal, because they're not as inspiring as they seem. Spartacus is the most famous gladiator in history, and his story is genuinely remarkable. In 73 BCE, he and about 70 other gladiators escaped from Miletus in Capua. They armed themselves, defeated the local Roman forces, sent to recapture them, and began attracting followers. Other escaped slaves, desperate poor people, anyone with a grudge against Rome. What started as a small band of escaped gladiators grew into an army of tens of thousands. For 2 years, Spartacus and his forces defeated multiple Roman armies, raided Italy, and became Rome's worst nightmare. The rebellion showed that gladiators these men trained to kill could turn their skills against their oppressors when given the chance. But here's what the story of Spartacus actually reveals. The rebellion ultimately failed. Spartacus and most of his followers were killed. The survivors were crucified along the Appian Way. 6,000 crosses lining the road from Capua to Rome as a message to anyone else considering rebellion. The message was clear. You can fight back, but you'll lose, and the consequences will be horrific. For you, in your cell, this story is both inspiring and terrifying. Yes, Spartacus showed that gladiators could resist, but he also showed what happened when you resisted. The rebellion's failure reinforced that you're trapped in a system too powerful to overcome, and the brutal suppression sent a message that lasted for centuries. Don't even think about it. The historical Spartacus was likely a Thracian warrior enslaved by Rome. He was trained as a gladiator but refused to accept his fate. His military skill, leadership abilities, and charisma made him a natural leader, but he was also operating in a specific historical moment when Roman forces were spread thin, when social tensions were high, when circumstances allowed the rebellion to grow beyond what should have been possible. For you, those circumstances don't exist. The Roman military is strong, organized, and experienced at suppressing revolts. The surveillance and security at your ludus have been improved based on lessons learned from Spartacus. The chains binding you aren't just physical, they're psychological, social, and systematic. Spartacus's rebellion was remarkable because it was so unusual, so unlikely, and ultimately so futile. Now let's talk about Flamma, who represents a different kind of gladiator legend. Flamma fought 34 times, won 21 bouts, drew 9, and was defeated 4 times, but spared each time. He was offered the rudes, freedom, 4 separate times, and refused it every time, choosing to continue fighting. Roman writers pointed to Flamma as an example of the nobility of gladiatorial combat. Here was a man so devoted to the arena, so honorable that he turned down freedom to keep fighting. What a testament to the gladiatorial spirit. But let's think critically about this story. What kind of psychological damage would cause a man to refuse freedom 4 times? What had the gladiatorial system done to Flamma that he couldn't imagine life outside the arena? Was this nobility? Or was this a man so broken and conditioned by the system that he literally couldn't function outside it? Flamma's story is less an inspiration and more a tragedy. He'd been so thoroughly dehumanized, so completely transformed into a weapon, that he'd lost the ability to be anything else. The fact that Romans celebrated this as noble rather than recognizing it as profound psychological damage tells you everything about how they viewed gladiators. And here's another uncomfortable reality. We only know about Flamma because he was exceptional. For every gladiator who fought 34 times, thousands died in their first few bouts and left no record. Flamma's survival was so unusual that it became legendary, which tells you just how rare survival actually was. Spiculus was another legendary gladiator, famous for being Emperor Nero's favorite. Nero showered him with gifts, houses, money, possibly even positions of honor. When Nero's reign was collapsing and the emperor faced death, he reportedly called for Spiculus, wanting this gladiator to kill him rather than face execution at the hands of his enemies. Spiculus couldn't be found in time, and Nero had to commit suicide without his favored gladiator's assistance. This story is held up as an example of how gladiators could achieve fame and wealth. But let's examine what it actually reveals. Spiculus's wealth and status were entirely dependent on one emperor's whim. He had no independent power, no real security. When Nero died, did Spiculus keep his wealth? Did he remain honored? History doesn't tell us, which probably means no. His entire elevated status existed only because he amused an increasingly erratic emperor. He was still a toy, still a possession, just a very expensive one. And the fact that Nero wanted him to deliver the killing blow shows that Spiculus was still seen primarily as a weapon, a tool for killing, even in this supposedly honored position. Other famous gladiators had similar stories. Carpophorus was legendary for fighting wild animals, supposedly killing a rhinoceros, an elephant, and 20 other animals in a single day. This is likely exaggerated, but the legend persisted. He was celebrated for this, but he was still a gladiator, still infamous, still socially despised despite his fame. Tetraites was a famous Murmiro who fought in the Colosseum's opening games. He fought Prudes, another famous gladiator, in a bout so evenly matched and so well fought that Emperor Titus granted both men the Rudes simultaneously, a rare double award of freedom. This sounds wonderful until you remember that their lives had been put in mortal danger for entertainment, and their reward was simply not having to do it anymore. Some gladiators achieved fame through novelty. Gladiatrices, female gladiators, were rare enough to be sensational. They fought each other, or sometimes wild animals, and their bouts were marketed as exotic entertainment. The few we know about by name, Amazonia and Achillea, fought each other in a famous bout, achieved fame, but they faced the same dangers as male gladiators, plus additional exploitation as women in a male-dominated system. The problem with all these legendary stories is that they create a distorted picture of gladiatorial life. They're survivor bias in its purest form. We remember the exceptional cases, the ones who won enough fights to become famous, who caught the attention of emperors, who survived long enough to have their names recorded. We don't remember the thousands of men whose names were never recorded, who died in their first or second fight, who were buried in mass graves and forgotten. We don't remember the average gladiators who fought a few times, earned no particular fame, died on the sand, and left no trace. Those men were the norm, and the legends were the extremely rare exceptions. For you, sitting in your cell, hearing these stories, they serve a psychological function. They give you hope that maybe you could be exceptional too. Maybe you could be the next Spartacus, the next Flamma, the next Spiculus. This hope might help you survive psychologically, might motivate you to train harder, might make the unbearable slightly more bearable. But realistically, you're not going to be legendary. The mathematics we discussed earlier make that clear. You're almost certainly going to be one of the forgotten thousands, dying anonymously after a few fights, remembered by no one except maybe your fellow gladiators who will forget you soon enough when they face their own deaths. The rebellion of Spartacus showed that resistance was possible but futile. The fame of Flamma showed that survival was possible, but at the cost of your humanity. The wealth of Spiculus showed that rewards were possible, but dependent on the whims of the powerful. Every legend, examined closely, reinforces rather than undermines the fundamental horror of gladiatorial life. There's also the uncomfortable reality that many famous gladiator stories were probably exaggerated or invented. Roman writers weren't concerned with historical accuracy the way modern historians are. They told stories to make points, to entertain readers, to illustrate moral lessons. The gladiator legends served narrative purposes, which means we should be skeptical about their literal truth. Did Flamma really refuse freedom 4 times? Or is this a story Roman writers told to romanticize gladiatorial combat? Did Spartacus really plan to leave Italy and return his followers to their homelands? Or did later writers attribute this noble intention to make the story more palatable? Did Spiculus really receive palaces, or did the stories grow in the telling? We can't know for certain. What we can know is that these stories served the interests of the Romans who told them. Stories about noble gladiators who loved fighting supported the system by suggesting it wasn't as brutal as it appeared. Stories about rebel gladiators being defeated reinforced that resistance was futile. Stories about gladiators achieving wealth proved the system provided opportunity for advancement. All of these narratives supported the continuation of gladiatorial games by making them seem less problematic than they actually were. And you, in your cell, hearing these stories, are being psychologically managed just as surely as you're being physically controlled. The legends also create pressure. If Flamma fought 34 times, why? Can't you fight more? If Spartacus could lead a rebellion, why can't you escape? If Spiculus could win an emperor's favor, why can't you become famous? The stories set impossible standards that make your own struggles seem like personal failures rather than systemic problems. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the legends. They make you blame yourself for not achieving the impossible. You're not failing because the system is designed to kill you. You're failing because you're not as skilled as Flamma, as brave as Spartacus, as charismatic as Spiculus. The legends become weapons used against you, tools to extract more effort, more risk-taking, more sacrifice from men who have already given everything. The reality is that most gladiators had no legends, no stories, no fame. They lived, fought, died, and were forgotten. Their bones were buried in mass graves that archaeologists now study to understand gladiatorial life. Their names, if recorded at all, appear in fragmentary inscriptions or graffiti. They were the background characters in other people's stories, the unnamed fighters who died to make the famous gladiators' victories meaningful. You would be one of them. Not legendary, not remarkable. Just another body on the sand, another statistic in the brutal mathematics of the arena, another forgotten victim of a system designed to create spectacle from human suffering. Chapter 8. Why you specifically would fail. You are back where we started, standing in that tunnel beneath the Colosseum, waiting for the gate to open. But now you understand exactly what you're facing. Let's talk about why you, specifically, a modern person watching this video, would absolutely fail as a gladiator. First, physical conditioning. You're not prepared for this. Even if you're relatively fit by modern standards, you go to the gym, you play sports, you're in decent shape. You're not conditioned for gladiatorial combat. You've never worn 50 pounds of armor for hours. You've never fought to exhaustion while someone tries to kill you. You've never developed the specific strength and endurance required for ancient combat. Modern fitness focuses on aesthetics, general health, or specific sports performance. Gladiator training focused on one thing: not dying in the arena. The conditioning was brutal, specific, and relentless. Your 3 times a week gym routine hasn't prepared you for training 6 hours a day, every day, with wooden weapons heavier than real ones, while being beaten with sticks if your form is wrong. And your diet? You're used to varied nutrition, probably high in processed foods, definitely higher in meat than the gladiator diet. The switch to barley porridge and beans would shock your system. You'd lose weight initially, feel constantly hungry, and struggle to maintain your energy levels. Your body would adapt eventually, but that adaptation period would be miserable and would hamper your training effectiveness. Second, pain tolerance. You're not used to pain. Modern life is designed to minimize discomfort. You take painkillers for headaches. You rest when you're sore. You seek medical treatment for injuries. Gladiators lived with constant pain, bruises, cuts, broken bones, muscle tears, and kept training and fighting through it. The first time the doctors hits you with a stick or incorrect form, you'd be shocked and hurt. The 15th time, when you're already covered in bruises and aching from hours of stance training, you might break down completely. Modern people aren't conditioned to accept pain as a constant part of life, and the psychological adjustment would be overwhelming. Third, psychological preparation. You've probably never seriously hurt another person, much less killed someone. The psychological barriers that prevent most modern people from violence are strong and appropriate for civilized society, but they'd be fatal in the arena. The first time you faced a real opponent trying to kill you, your training would likely evaporate under the weight of genuine terror. You'd freeze, or you'd fight wildly and ineffectively, or you'd try to reason with your opponent, who doesn't speak your language and wouldn't care if he did. The psychological conditioning that made gladiators capable of killing was extensive, brutal, and would likely break you before it transformed you. Fourth, disease resistance. Modern people have immune systems trained by a relatively clean environment and supported by medical care. Roman diseases would devastate you. The first dysentery outbreak in the ludus would probably kill you. The infections from minor wounds would become life-threatening because you lacked the antibodies Romans had developed through constant exposure. Even if you somehow survived the training and made it to your first fight, these diseases would weaken you continuously. You'd be fighting at a disadvantage, your body struggling with illness, while also trying to perform in combat. This is a recipe for quick death. Fifth, cultural context. You don't speak Latin unless you're a classical scholar, and even then, your Latin isn't the vulgar Latin that Romans actually spoke. You don't understand Roman social customs, religious practices, or cultural expectations. You'd be isolated in ways that would compound the psychological trauma. The other gladiators might be from dozens of different cultures: Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Africans, other Romans. Communication would be difficult. Forming the alliances and friendships that made life bearable would be nearly impossible. You'd be truly alone in the most terrifying experience imaginable. Sixth, no context for the violence. Modern people, even those who've been in fights, don't have context for the specific type of violence in gladiatorial combat. It's not the sudden shock of a car accident, not the impersonal distance of modern warfare, not the limited scope of a bar fight. It's sustained, intimate violence with edged weapons, where you can see your opponent's face as you try to kill him, and he tries to kill you. The sensory experience, the smell of blood and fear, the sound of weapons on flesh, the sight of horrific wounds, the feeling of your blade entering a human body. All of this would be overwhelming. Many people would vomit, panic, or psychologically shut down. And in the arena, any of these responses means death. Seventh, no adaptation time. You'd be thrust into this system suddenly. One moment you're in the modern world, the next you're branded property being trained to fight to the death. You'd have no time to gradually adjust, to slowly build up tolerance for the conditions, to mentally prepare for what's coming. Modern military training takes months and happens in stages specifically because sudden immersion in combat conditions breaks most people. You'd be experiencing that breaking without any of the support systems, psychological preparation, or gradual exposure that modern militaries use to prevent complete psychological collapse. Eighth, no exit option. In modern life, if something becomes unbearable, you can usually quit. Hate your job, find a new one. Toxic relationship, end it. Unbearable situation, change it or leave. This ability to exit gives you psychological resilience. You know that suffering is temporary because you have agency to change your circumstances. As a gladiator, you have no exit option. You can't quit. You can't negotiate. You can't change your situation through any action available to you, except possibly winning enough fights to earn freedom, which takes years and is statistically unlikely. This total lack of agency would be psychologically devastating in ways that modern people can't really prepare for. Ninth, different values. You've been raised to value individual human life, to believe that killing is wrong, to see violence as a failure of civilization. These values would be liabilities in the gladiatorial world. You'd struggle with the moral implications of what you're being asked to do, and this moral struggle would distract and weaken you. Romans who became gladiators might have had different values to start with, or they'd been raised in a world where slavery and violence were normalized. They'd also been broken down by the system before being required to kill. You'd be trying to function as a gladiator while still holding values incompatible with the role, and this internal conflict would destroy you mentally. 10th, physical differences. Modern people are often taller than ancient Romans due to better nutrition over generations, but we're not necessarily stronger or tougher. Our bones are less dense than people who worked physically their entire lives. Our hands aren't calloused from manual labor. Our bodies haven't been hardened by the constant physical stress that was normal in the ancient world. The training would literally break your body in ways it's not prepared for. Stress fractures, torn muscles, joint damage. Your body would fail under demands it wasn't designed to meet. And unlike modern athletes who push their bodies to limits, you'd have no sports medicine, no physical therapy, no recovery protocols. You'd just be expected to keep training and fighting with an increasingly damaged body. Let me paint you one final scenario. Imagine the gate opens. You walk into the arena. The crowd is roaring, but you can't process it because you're overwhelmed by sensory overload. Your opponent approaches. Let's say he's a veteran with a dozen fights under his belt. He's done this before. You haven't. He sees immediately that you're terrified, inexperienced, already defeated mentally. He moves confidently, aggressively, because he knows he's already won. You try to remember your training, but your hands are shaking. Your breathing is wrong. Your stance is falling apart. He attacks. You barely block. He attacks again. You overreact, lose balance. Third attack connects. Maybe his sword gets past your shield. Maybe his shield bash knocks you down. You're on the sand looking up at him, and you realize with perfect clarity that you're about to die. You try to appeal for mercy, but you don't know the gesture. And even if you did, the crowd is calling for your blood because you put on a terrible show. Your opponent looks to the editor, gets the signal, and moves to deliver the killing blow. In your last moments, you understand that every single thing about you, your education, your modern sensibilities, your values, your life experience, has been useless here. You are never going to survive this. This is why you wouldn't survive a day as a Roman gladiator. Not because you're weak or cowardly, but because you're a product of a completely different world. The skills, values, and experiences that serve you well in modern life are worse than useless in the gladiatorial arena. They're active liabilities. The Romans who became gladiators and survived weren't superhuman. They were people who had been systematically broken down and rebuilt by a system designed over centuries to create effective fighters. Many of them still died, most of them actually. And you, without that preparation, without that conditioning, without the cultural context and physical adaptation, would have no chance at all. Conclusion. So here we are, back in the 21st century, where the most dangerous combat you face is arguing with strangers on the internet. And the most serious physical challenge is climbing stairs. You've now experienced, at least intellectually, what life as a Roman gladiator was actually like. The brutal training that would break your body, the living conditions that would crush your spirit, the social stigma that would dehumanize you, the arena combat that would terrify and probably kill you, the mathematical certainty that you'd eventually die for entertainment. And you've learned why you specifically wouldn't survive it, not because you're inadequate by modern standards, but because modern standards have nothing to do with gladiatorial survival. You're optimized for a different world, and dropping you into the gladiatorial system would be like dropping a house cat into a Roman arena and expecting it to fight a lion. The cat isn't a bad cat, it's just completely unsuited for the situation. Let's talk about what the gladiatorial system reveals about Roman civilization. On one hand, the Romans built incredible architecture, developed sophisticated law codes, created art and literature that influenced Western civilization for millennia. On the other hand, they normalized slavery, celebrated extreme violence, and treated human lives as disposable entertainment. This contradiction is difficult for modern people to process. How could a civilization be both so advanced and so brutal? The answer is that values about human life, individual dignity, and the morality of violence are culturally constructed. The Romans didn't see gladiatorial combat as morally wrong because their entire cultural framework normalized it. This doesn't make it any less horrific. It just explains why it persisted for centuries and why respectable Romans could sponsor games, attend them with their families, and feel no moral qualms about watching people die for entertainment. Their moral framework didn't categorize this as wrong, the same way our moral framework doesn't categorize many things as wrong that future civilizations might view with horror. The gladiatorial system also reveals something about human nature. People can be conditioned to accept almost anything as normal. Slavery, extreme violence, dehumanization of others, all of this can become background reality if the cultural context supports it. This is both a testament to human adaptability and a warning about the dangers of normalizing cruelty. The men who became gladiators weren't monsters. They were victims of a system that saw them as tools rather than people. The Romans who watched gladiatorial combat weren't evil. They were products of their culture who had been socialized to view certain types of violence as acceptable entertainment. This doesn't excuse the system, but it does help us understand how such a system could exist and persist. The end of gladiatorial combat came gradually, not through sudden moral awakening, but through changing cultural values, influenced by Christianity and practical factors like the expense of maintaining the system and the decline of Roman military power that had provided the constant stream of prisoners of war who became gladiators. The last recorded gladiatorial games in Rome were in 404 CE, when a Christian monk named Telemachus reportedly jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was killed by the outraged crowd. The Emperor Honorius then banned gladiatorial combat, though beast hunts continued for another century or so. The era of the gladiators ended not with triumph, but with a slow fade into history. Today, gladiatorial combat has been romanticized and sanitized in countless movies, books, and games. We use gladiator as a metaphor for athletes and competitors. We've stripped away the reality, the slavery, the social stigma, the genuine horror, and kept only the superficial appeal of combat and victory. This romanticization is itself revealing. We're drawn to the idea of gladiators because combat is exciting, victory is satisfying, and we like stories of underdogs overcoming odds. But we remove the context that would make us uncomfortable. The fact that gladiators were slaves forced to kill for entertainment, that most died young after miserable lives, that the system was fundamentally about exploitation and dehumanization. The real lesson of gladiatorial combat isn't about courage or martial skill. It's about how societies can construct systems of cruelty and normalize them so thoroughly that they seem natural and acceptable. It's about how individual humans can be transformed into objects, weapons, entertainment. It's about the importance of recognizing the humanity in all people and the dangers of systems that categorize some humans as less than others. So as you sit there, comfortable and safe, be grateful. Grateful that you live in a time and place where human life has more value, where entertainment doesn't require death, where you have agency over your own existence. Be grateful that the worst violence you face is virtual and the most serious social stigma is probably related to your choice of smartphone or political opinions. And maybe, just maybe, use this knowledge to think critically about the systems in our own time that dehumanize people, that treat some lives as less valuable than others, that normalize cruelty through cultural conditioning. The gladiatorial system is gone, but the human capacity to create such systems remains. Vigilance about our own cultural blind spots is essential. The next time you watch a historical drama about gladiators, remember what you've learned. Remember the reality behind the Hollywood spectacle. Remember the men who suffered and died, not for glory or honor, but because a society decided their lives were worth less than the entertainment value of their deaths. Remember that you, for all your modern comforts and privileges, would have been just another body on the sand if you'd had the profound misfortune of being born into that life. There's no shame in this admission. It's simply recognition that survival in that system required adaptations that would destroy much of what makes you who you are. And finally, remember to appreciate the mundane safety of modern life. Yes, we have problems. Yes, modern life is stressful in its own ways, but you're not going to be killed for entertainment tomorrow. No one is going to make you fight to the death with a sword. You don't live in constant fear of brutal violence. You have agency, rights, and the ability to change your circumstances. These aren't small things. These are the product of centuries of moral progress, of societies slowly developing values that recognize the inherent dignity and worth of all human life. The fact that gladiatorial combat now seems barbaric to us is actually progress, evidence that human moral frameworks can evolve toward more humane values. So take a moment to appreciate your boring, safe, comfortable life. Appreciate that the biggest danger you face today is probably related to your commute or your bad posture from sitting too much. Appreciate that your entertainment doesn't require anyone to die. Appreciate that you're free, that your life has value, that you're seen as human rather than property. And remember the gladiators, not as romanticized heroes from movies, but as real men who suffered and died in a system designed to exploit them. Remember them as a warning about what humans are capable of, normalizing, and as a reminder of why protecting human dignity matters. You wouldn't have survived a day as a Roman gladiator, but you also won't have to, and that's something worth celebrating. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go appreciate my comfortable chair and the fact that no one is trying to stab me with a gladius. Stay safe, stay grateful, and maybe think twice before romanticizing historical violence. Until next time. Epilogue: the archaeological evidence. Before we close, let's talk about how we actually know all this. You might be wondering, how do historians reconstruct the daily life of gladiators with such detail? What evidence survives from nearly 2,000 years ago? The answer is more than you'd think, and it paints a picture that's remarkably consistent with the horror we've described. First, we have the physical evidence. The Colosseum still stands, and beneath it, the Hippodrome, that complex network of tunnels where you waited for death, has been excavated and studied. Archaeologists have mapped the corridors, the animal cages, the lift systems. You can visit it today and walk the same paths gladiators walked, though thankfully without the terror they felt. We've also excavated gladiatorial schools. The Ludus Magnus near the Colosseum has been partially excavated, revealing the cell structure, training areas, and living conditions we described. The cells were indeed as small and miserable as we said. The training yards show wear patterns from centuries of practice. The medical facilities reveal the types of injuries treated and the primitive but effective treatments used. Perhaps most revealing are the gladiator cemeteries. In 1993, archaeologists discovered a gladiator cemetery in Ephesus, Turkey, containing the remains of about 70 gladiators. Analysis of their bones told stories that written records never could. These skeletons showed evidence of healed fractures, arms, legs, skulls, indicating they'd survived previous fights and injuries. They showed signs of the specific types of wounds caused by gladiatorial weapons. They revealed the bone density patterns consistent with the intense physical training we described. And they showed the dietary signatures of that barley-heavy diet. Some skeletons had evidence of square holes punched through the skull. The coup de grace delivered by those hammer-wielding attendants dressed as Charon. Death hadn't come from the opponent's sword, but from the final blow, ensuring they were dead before being dragged off. This confirmed the brutal efficiency of the arena's death protocols. We also have written records. Roman writers like Seneca, Cicero, and Tacitus wrote about gladiatorial combat, though often from the perspective of spectators or critics, rather than gladiators themselves. Their descriptions of the games, the crowd behavior, and the politics surrounding gladiatorial spectacles fill in the context around the fights themselves. Graffiti from Pompeii provides fascinating glimpses into gladiator celebrity culture. Walls throughout the city bear inscriptions praising specific gladiators, recording fight outcomes, and sometimes including romantic or sexual propositions directed at famous fighters. Salatus, the Thracian, makes all the girls sigh, reads one inscription. These scraps of ancient graffiti humanize the gladiators and show how they were viewed by ordinary Romans. Medical texts from the Roman physician Galen, who served as a doctor at a gladiatorial school, describe the types of injuries gladiators sustained and the treatments used. His writings are remarkably detailed about wound types, infection management, and surgical procedures. This gives us direct medical evidence about the violence gladiators experienced and survived. Artistic depictions survive in mosaics, frescoes, and sculpture throughout the former Roman Empire. These show gladiator types in detail, their armor, weapons, fighting stances, and even specific famous fights. While artistic representations aren't always literally accurate, the consistency across hundreds of depictions gives us confidence in reconstructing what gladiatorial combat actually looked like. We have legal codes that specify the status of gladiators, the contracts binding volunteer gladiators, and the regulations around gladiatorial schools. These dry legal documents reveal the systemic nature of gladiatorial exploitation and confirm that gladiators really were infames with no legal rights. Tombstones of gladiators sometimes survive, often erected by fellow gladiators or by the burial associations we mentioned. These epitaphs typically record the gladiator's name, his type, his number of victories, and sometimes his age at death. The young ages are striking. Many died in their 20s or early 30s. The victory counts are usually low. Most gladiators on these tombstones had won fewer than 10 fights. Even the language used to discuss gladiators is revealing. Romans didn't use euphemisms. They were matter of fact about what gladiatorial combat was, killing for entertainment. The directness of the language used in contracts, laws, and descriptions shows how normalized this violence was in Roman culture. Some gladiators left written records themselves, though these are rare. Inscriptions in gladiatorial schools include practice rosters, records of fights, and occasionally personal messages. These fragments in the gladiators' own words are poignant reminders that these were real people with thoughts, feelings, and lives beyond their role as entertainment. The archaeological and historical evidence consistently paints the same picture. Gladiatorial combat was exactly as brutal, exploitative, and dehumanizing as we've described. This isn't speculation or exaggeration. This is what the evidence shows. And here's what's perhaps most striking. The Romans documented all of this quite openly. They weren't hiding the brutality or ashamed of the exploitation. They recorded it in art, literature, law, and physical infrastructure because to them, this was normal. It was just how their society worked. This openness in the records is itself revealing. Modern societies that do terrible things often try to hide or deny them. The Romans felt no need to hide gladiatorial combat because they didn't see it as wrong. The casual way they documented the system shows how thoroughly they'd normalized something that modern people find horrific. When you visit the Colosseum today, you're walking through a monument to this normalized cruelty. The building is magnificent, Roman engineering at its finest, but it was built specifically to facilitate the efficient killing of humans for entertainment. Beauty and horror coexisted in the same structure, just as they coexisted in Roman civilization itself. The evidence also shows us the resistance, though it was rare. We have records of gladiator suicides, escape, attempts, and yes, the Spartacus rebellion. These acts of resistance prove that gladiators didn't accept their fate passively. They were victims of a system, but they were also humans who fought against their oppression when possible. What the evidence doesn't show us, and this is important, is the internal experience of being a gladiator. We have the physical remains, the legal documents, the external descriptions, but we don't have diaries or personal accounts that tell us what it actually felt like to be a gladiator waiting to fight, or to kill someone in the arena, or to live with the constant fear and trauma. That internal experience we have to reconstruct through empathy and understanding of human psychology. We know how modern combat veterans experience PTSD. We know how prisoners in harsh conditions suffer psychologically. We know how people react to powerlessness and exploitation. We extrapolate from this knowledge to understand what gladiators likely experienced, emotionally and psychologically. This reconstruction is necessarily somewhat speculative, but it's grounded in our understanding of universal human responses to trauma and violence. While the specific cultural context was Roman, the underlying human psychology hasn't changed. Fear, pain, grief, rage, despair. These are human universals that gladiators certainly experienced. The archaeological and historical evidence gives us the framework. Human psychology and empathy fill in the subjective experience. Together, they paint a comprehensive picture of gladiatorial life that's both historically grounded and humanly compelling. And that picture, consistently and overwhelmingly, shows that being a gladiator was a nightmare from which most men never woke. The evidence supports everything we've said about the training, living conditions, combat reality, and survival odds. This wasn't just storytelling. This was reconstructing historical reality from the traces left behind. So when you walk away from this video with a new understanding of gladiatorial combat, know that this understanding is built on solid evidence. The horror wasn't exaggerated for effect. If anything, we've probably understated it, because the full reality of day-to-day gladiatorial existence included thousands of small miseries and indignities that don't make for compelling narrative, but ground down the human spirit nonetheless. The gladiators were real people who suffered and died in this system. The evidence ensures we remember them not as entertainment figures or fictional heroes, but as historical victims of systematic exploitation. That's the final service the archaeological and historical record provides. It preserves the memory of people who are meant to be forgotten once they'd served their purpose as entertainment. Now finally, we're done. You know why you wouldn't survive as a Roman gladiator, and you know that this knowledge comes from real evidence, real history, real human suffering. Take that knowledge, appreciate your modern life, and remember the past, not to romanticize it, but to learn from it.